Between August the 31st and November the 9th, 1888, 5 brutal and shocking murders brought terror and panic to the East End of London. The perpetrator of the heinous crimes was never brought to justice, and to this day his identity remains one of history's most enduring mysteries. At first, the killer was referred to as the Whitechapel murderer or fiend, then as Leather Apron. But in late September, a letter was sent to the Central News Agency, which was based in this building on New Bridge Street in the City of London. Written in red ink and couched in boastful and mocking terms, the letter began, "Dear Boss, I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet." Having stated that "I am down on whores and I shan't quit ripping them till I do get buckled," the author gloated that he loved his work and that he wanted to start again, warned that they would soon hear of him with his funny little games, and threatened that the next job he did he would clip the ladies' ears off and send to the police officers. Having urged them to "keep this letter back till I do a bit more work," the author signed his missive Jack the Ripper, a name that chillingly encapsulated the horror and revulsion that the crimes were generating. Convinced that the letter was a prank, the Central News did nothing with it for 2 days. But on the 29th of September, an employee of the agency, Thomas Bulling, forwarded it to Chief Constable Adolphus Frederick Williamson at Scotland Yard, with a covering letter that read, "The editor presents his compliments to Mr. Williamson and begs to inform him the enclosed was sent to the Central News 2 days ago and was treated as a joke." Within 24 hours of the police receiving the letter, in the early hours of the 30th of September, the murders of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes took place, leaving the police with little choice but to take a closer look at the outlandish claims and threats that had been made by Jack the Ripper in the Dear Boss letter. Then, on Monday the 1st of October, a postcard arrived at the Central News, which was smeared with what appeared to be blood, and which again purported to have come from the killer. It read, "I wasn't codding, dear old boss, when I gave you the tip. You'll hear about Saucy Jacky's work tomorrow. Double event this time. Number 1 squealed a bit, couldn't finish straight off, had no time to get ears for police. Thanks for keeping last letter back till I got to work again. Jack the Ripper." Desperate for a breakthrough, the Metropolitan Police took the decision to make the Dear Boss letter and the Saucy Jacky postcard public, and within days facsimiles of them were appearing in newspapers nationwide. The resultant publicity encouraged hoaxers across the country to reach for their pens, and hundreds of similar prank letters flooded in, many of them bearing the name by which the unknown miscreant would be ever after known, Jack the Ripper. It is highly unlikely that the writer of the Dear Boss letter and the unknown miscreant responsible for the Whitechapel murders were one and the same person. The perpetrator of the crimes may have been any one of the many suspects whose names have been put forward over the years, but Jack the Ripper was the person that composed the Dear Boss missive that bore that signature, although it has to be said that the two have now become so intertwined that any distinction between them is blurred to the point of being indistinguishable. But the two were almost certainly different people, and in this video I shall be looking at the possible identity of the author of the Dear Boss letter as opposed to the perpetrator of the Whitechapel murders, and I will present you with the names of those who have, over the years, been put forward as the possible creator of criminal history's most infamous nom de plume. Despite the fact that the police had taken the Dear Boss letter seriously enough to release facsimiles of it to the newspapers, Sir Charles Warren, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, appears to have entertained serious doubts as to its having been written by the perpetrator of the atrocities almost from the outset. On the 10th of October 1888 he wrote to Sir Godfrey Lushington, the permanent Under-Secretary at the Home Office, to inform him of his reservations. "At present I think the whole thing a hoax, but of course we are bound to try and ascertain the writer in any case.
It appears that at the time there was a widespread belief amongst those in the know that the letter's writer was a member of the press. According to Sir Robert Anderson, who throughout the murders was the head of the Criminal Investigation Department and the Assistant Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, the Dear Boss letter was the creation of an enterprising London journalist. The crime writer and journalist Edgar Wallace would later recall that, in his days as a reporter, the better informed Fleet Street men were satisfied that a newspaperman was behind the letters. However, one of the first people to air publicly the suspicion that the letter's author was a journalist was George R. Sims, who in his weekly column in the Referee newspaper on Sunday the 7th of October 1888 opined that the fact that the self-postcard proclaimed assassin sent his imitation blood-besmeared communication to the Central News people opens up a wide field for theory. How many among you, my dear readers, would have hit upon the idea of the Central News as a receptacle for your confidence? You may have sent your joke to the Telegraph, the Times, any morning or evening newspaper, but I will lay odds that it would never have occurred to you to communicate with a press agency. Curious, is it not, that this maniac makes his communication to an agency which serves the entire press? It is an idea which might occur to a pressman, perhaps, and even then it would probably only occur to someone connected with the editorial department of a newspaper, someone who knew what the Central News was and the place it filled in the business of news supply. This proceeding on Jack's part betrays an inner knowledge of the newspaper world which is certainly surprising. Everything therefore points to the fact that the jokist is professionally connected to the press. A year later, Charles Tempest Clarkson and J. Hall Richardson, in their book Police, wrote that the fame of Jack the Ripper spread far and wide. It is probable that nothing would have been heard of this cognomen had it not been for the indiscretion of Scotland Yard in publishing a facsimile of sensational letters sent to a news agency, which thereby gave to these interesting documents the stamp of official authority. In their retirement, several of the senior police officers who had been involved in the Whitechapel murders case would state that they actually knew the identity of the pressman who had coined the name Jack the Ripper. In his memoirs, which were serialised in Blackwood's magazine in March 1910, Sir Robert Anderson had this to say about the letter. The subject will come up again, and I will only add here that the Jack the Ripper letter, which is preserved in the Police Museum at Scotland Yard, is the creation of an enterprising London journalist. There was also a footnote in which Anderson revealed the reason for his reticence in naming the author of the letter. Having regard to the interest attaching to this case, I should almost be tempted to disclose the identity of the murderer and of the pressman who wrote the letter above referred to, provided that the publishers would accept all responsibility in view of a possible libel action. Anderson's reminiscences received widespread press coverage themselves, and on Saturday the 16th of April 1910, the East London Observer published the following letter. Echoes of the Whitechapel murders. To the editor of the East London Observer. Sir Robert Anderson, who is just now before the public eye, may like to know that the postcards, apparently written with blood, received by the H Division of Police, were the work of an enterprising local penny-a-liner who used his foreknowledge to line the reports of the receipt of these strange missives. At the time, the daily papers seized with avidity any murder news, and as the postcards were received by the police, the truth of the reports could not be denied. It never occurred to the intelligence CID that they could have traced the authorship of both postcards and reports. They know better now. Yours truly, a Wide-Awake Eastender, 11th of April, 1910. It should be pointed out, neither the Dear Boss letter nor the Saucy Jacky postcard were received by the Metropolitan Police's H Division, nor by any division for that matter, as they were in fact sent to the Central News. So either this Eastender was referring to different letters, or he was not as wide awake as he believed he was. Another senior officer who claimed to have had suspicions about the identity of the author of the Dear Boss letter was Sir Melville Macnaghten, who had joined the Metropolitan Police in June 1889 as Assistant Chief Constable. He retired in 1913 and published his memoirs titled Days of My Years in 1914. In a chapter devoted to Jack the Ripper, he looked back on the letter that was, he said, received at a well-known news agency addressed to the boss. Having commented that he considered it a mistake for the police to have made the letter public, he stated that, "In this ghastly production I have always thought I could detect the stained forefinger of the journalist." Indeed, a year later I had shrewd suspicions as to the actual author. But whoever did pen the gruesome stuff, it is certain to my mind that it was not the mad miscreant who had committed the murders. The name Jack the Ripper, however, had got abroad in the land and had caught on. It riveted the attention of the classes as well as the masses. So two high-ranking police officers evidently were of the opinion that the Dear Boss letter that coined the name Jack the Ripper was the invention of a journalist, and both hinted that they knew his identity, but both were unwilling to name him. However, one retired detective who had no qualms about naming the pressman responsible was ex-Detective Chief Inspector John George Littlechild, who on the 23rd of September 1913 replied to a letter from George Sims seeking information about the murderer's identity. With regard to the term Jack the Ripper, it was generally believed at the Yard that Tom Bullen of the Central News was the originator, but it is probable Moore, who was his chief, was the inventor. The man whom Littlechild refers to as Tom Bullen was in fact Thomas J. Bulling, and he was indeed employed at the Central News in 1888 at the time of the Whitechapel murders. In fact, it was he who had forwarded the Dear Boss letter to Scotland Yard on the 29th of September. Interestingly, it was also he who notified Chief Constable Williamson of a third missive from Jack the Ripper that he said had been received at the agency on the evening of Friday the 5th of October. Bulling didn't actually forward the letter this time, but sent a transcription of it along with the envelope in which it had been enclosed. His accompanying note read, "Dear Mr. Williamson, at 5 minutes to 9 o'clock tonight we received the following letter, the envelope of which I enclose, by which you will see it is in the same handwriting as the previous communications." He then painstakingly transcribed the entire letter, in which reference was made to the discovery on the 2nd of October of the headless and limbless torso of a woman in the foundations of the new Scotland Yard building that was then being constructed between the Embankment and Whitehall, which the press had dubbed the Whitehall Mystery. "Dear friend, in the name of God hear me. I swear I did not kill the female whose body was found at Whitehall. If she was an honest woman, I will hunt down and destroy her murderer. If she was a whore, God will bless the hand that slew her, for the women of Moab and Midian shall die, and their blood mingle with the dust. I never harm any others, or the divine power that protects and helps me in my grand work would quit for ever. Do as I do, and the light of glory shall shine upon you. I must get to work tomorrow. Treble event this time. Yes, 3 must be ripped. We'll send you a bit of face by post. I promise this, dear old boss. The police now reckon my work a practical joke. Well, Jackie's a very practical joker. Ha ha. Keep this back till 3 are wiped out, and you can show the cold meat. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper." Bulling then added, "Yours truly, T.J. Bulling." The fact that Bulling chose to send the police the envelope but not the actual letter is, to say the least, intriguing, and the fact that he took the trouble to copy the letter in full rather than just forward the original is puzzling. Unless, of course, there was no third letter and Bulling had composed it himself. What is also intriguing is that the police appear to have asked the Central News not to make this third letter public, and in consequence it did not receive the same amount of publicity that the original Dear Boss letter and the Saucy Jacky postcard did. Perhaps it was this letter that led the police to suspect Bulling of being the author of the correspondence. There have also been suggestions that there were similarities between Bulling's handwriting and the handwriting of the Dear Boss letter. The other suspected author, according to Littlechild, was John Moore, although Littlechild refers to him as Charles Moore, who at the time was the manager of the Central News. Either way, the Central News played an integral part in the name Jack the Ripper becoming widely used for the unknown perpetrator of the Whitechapel murders, and there is no doubt that the agency profited enormously from the stories it was selling to the newspapers as a consequence of the letters. And it didn't take long for the name to permeate the public consciousness as hundreds of hoaxers reached for their pens and began composing their own letters from the perpetrator, many of which were sent to the police, thus almost overwhelming their investigation with a veritable tidal wave of bogus correspondence, whilst at the same time enabling the newspapers to wring every ounce of sensationalism from the correspondence. As Truth put it on Thursday the 11th of October, "It is an ill wind, etc., and the Whitechapel horrors have proved a perfect godsend to the daily papers, occurring as they have done during the dead season. But what a fearful amount of trash has been written about them." No sooner was the letter signed Jack the Ripper published than hundreds of ghastly jokers at once addressed similar letters to the authorities, whilst constant readers wrote to their favourite organs to prove that the writer of the silly letter must have been the murderer. On the doctrine of probabilities, it is long odds against the murderer having written the Jack the Ripper letters. He may have, and so may thousands of others. Another possible culprit for authorship was suggested in August 1966 in an article that appeared in Crime and Detection, in which the author recalled a meeting he had had in 1931 with an ex-journalist whom he refers to only as Best, who, though well past 70, was spry and clear-minded. Their conversation turned to the Whitechapel murders, and Best talked of his days as a penny-a-liner on the Star newspaper, covering the crimes. He claimed that he and a provincial colleague had been responsible for all the Ripper letters in order to keep the business alive. Best told the author that a close reading of the Star of the time might be informative, and that an experienced graphologist with an open mind would be able to find in the original letters numerous earmarks of an experienced journalist at work. That Best should have worked for the Star is interesting, as the Star was the newspaper that in early September had gone to town over coverage of the escapades of Leather Apron. In fact, so lurid was the Star's reporting of Leather Apron that some commentators have expressed the opinion that the Star actually invented him. As September 1888 progressed and John Pizer was identified as Leather Apron but exonerated of any involvement in the crimes, mentions of this early suspect dwindled rapidly. But then the Jack the Ripper letter was made public, and the newspapers had a new bogeyman with which to terrify their readers. The Star, however, was openly critical of other newspapers' coverage of the Jack the Ripper letters, singling out the Daily Telegraph in particular for giving publicity to the correspondence, and questioning why they should print facsimiles of the ghastly but very silly letters from Jack the Ripper. "We were offered them by the Central News," the paper revealed, and declined to print them. In his 2009 book, Jack the Ripper, Andrew Cook claimed that Star journalist Frederick Best had been the reporter who had picked up the Leather Apron story, which was then worked into the Leather Apron scare by senior members of the newspaper. When interest in this story died out following the exoneration of John Pizer, Best had come up with the Dear Boss letter. Andrew even quotes from a letter purportedly written by John Brunner, a shareholder in the Star, in which he stated that Best should have been dismissed from the newspaper for an attempt to mislead central news during the Whitechapel murders. The book, which was subsequently made into a Channel 5 documentary, revealed Jack the Ripper, tabloid killer, even featured a graphologist who compared Frederick Best's handwriting with the handwriting of the letter to the Central News and concluded that in her opinion it was not anyone other than Best that wrote the Dear Boss letter. However, one other suspect whose name has been put forward as the author of the letter also had an association with the Star. On the 4th of October 1888, the Daily Telegraph published the facsimiles of the Dear Boss letter and the Saucy Jacky postcard and commented that the writer is probably an American or an Englishman who has mixed with our cousins on the other side of the Atlantic. Boss, fix me, shan't quit, and right away are American forms of expression. It is interesting to note that the Star had several Americans on its staff. John Pennell, its art critic, for example, came from Baltimore. Henry Jackson Wells Dam, or Harry Dam as he was known, a journalist with a somewhat checkered past who was born in San Francisco, also worked for the paper. Dam came to London in 1887 and became the correspondent for several New York newspapers. When T.P. O'Connor launched the Star in January 1888, Dam also contributed articles to it. Lincoln Springfield, who had been the Star's chief reporter at the time of the murders, claimed in his 1924 autobiography that Dam, as a freeborn American, was not, as were the rest of us, cowed by the English libel laws, and it was Dam, so Springfield claimed, who created a sensation by pushing the idea that the murders were the work of a miscreant known as Leather Apron. In November 1890, the Reverend Henry A. Monroe, a New York pastor, published a series of articles in the New York Age about his trip to Europe that summer, which appeared under the generic title of A Pastor's Summer Abroad. On the 8th of November, he gave details of his experiences when he had gone slumming in London and had paid a visit to Whitechapel, which, he wrote, would never have furnished a literary sensation had it not been for the series of 8 atrocious murders that some maniac committed here. Few people in London believe in the genuineness of the Jack the Ripper letters, he continued. They were simply the invention of some sensational fool or else a newspaper fake. In fact, there is a strong suspicion that a New York World reporter might have been exercising his peculiar home talent just to try its effect upon our British cousins. This was the first hint of Harry Dam being behind the original Jack the Ripper correspondence, although it should be noted that Monroe didn't actually name the reporter in question. However, a little under a month later, Harry Dam was linked directly to the authorship of the Dear Boss letter by an article that appeared in the San Francisco Examiner. Commenting on the story in its edition of Thursday the 4th of December, the Carson City Morning Appeal couldn't resist punning. The Examiner claims that Harry Dam, an old newspaper man, is the author of the Jack the Ripper letters. They always had the appearance of being a damn fake to the Appeal. Meanwhile, the Los Angeles Herald on Friday the 5th of December published the reaction to the claim of the man who had been the Star's proprietor at the time the letter was written. Jack the Ripper. Editor O'Connor goes away from home to learn the news. Chicago, December 4. Referring to the story that Harry Dam, a New York and San Francisco journalist, while at work on the London Star, concocted the Jack the Ripper letters, which created such a sensation in London in connection with the Whitechapel murders, T.P. O'Connor, MP, editor of the Star at the time, says he never heard of the story before and doesn't believe a word of it. And with that, our gallery of rogue reporters who may have been responsible for penning the most infamous name in criminal history is complete. The case against all of them was circumstantial, and any or none of them may have been the composer of the Dear Boss Jack the Ripper letter. Although there appears to be a consensus amongst the police and the denizens of Fleet Street at the time that a journalist had penned the missive, there was, it seems, no real consensus as to his identity, nor could there have been unless the author actually confessed his authorship. The highest-ranking police officers on the case claimed to have either known or suspected the author's identity, but were reluctant to actually go public with his name. The one police officer who did name any possible authors, in a private letter to George Sims, Detective Chief Inspector John George Littlechild suggested that the letter came from within the Central News Agency and was the work of either Tom Bulling or John Moore. Sadly, we don't know enough about them to be able to actually pass any judgment on their viability. Best does seem a promising nominee, but then again, so too does Harry Dam. The fact is that unless some private correspondence comes to light that reveals without a shadow of a doubt that one of them was behind the Dear Boss hoax, then we are destined to remain in the dark about who it was that actually wrote the letter and was therefore Jack the Ripper. What is certain, though, is that whoever the originator of the name was, he could not have realised as he scrawled that signature that he was about to create a legend that would turn a series of sordid East End murders into an international phenomenon, and that from that point on, the line that separated the unknown miscreant who was responsible for the Whitechapel atrocities from the fictional creation, Jack the Ripper, would become so blurred as to be virtually non-existent. And at that, to quote George Sims, I think I will leave it.